Welcome back, guys. So, let's continue. King's Quest II continues the story of the first game, in which Sir Graham became the King of Daventry. Don't ask. 1 year has passed, and now King Graham desires to find a queen. So, he looks in the magic mirror and sees the perfect girl along with the perfect tower, from which she requires to be rescued by a perfect man. This ongoing perfection reaches its height when Graham changes his crown to an adventurer's cap. I just don't know why, but I love this moment. And so he takes onto himself to do this heroic deed. So the game begins, and the first thing I want to do is to type look and see if anything has been changed. Hey, check it out! Flavor text! The original would simply say, nothing interesting here. So it's a step in the right direction, but maybe it's the same for every place. Huh, who would have guessed it's different and... Wait, it even comments on the interactable objects in the room! And it does it for every location! And this is what I'm freaking talking about, feedback. This is what was lacking in the original game, and surprisingly, sequel remedies this issue completely. Because of this feedback, it's not only more interesting to interact with the world, but it makes it possible to figure out puzzles on your own. There are even clues in the game, which don't just tell you the solutions, but guide your thoughts in the right direction so that you could figure out puzzles by yourself. That is not the only thing. Almost everything was improved in the sequel. The presentation, the atmosphere, the setting, even the characters feel like people rather than talking signs, because they require much more complex interactions. For example, there is a monk who doesn't acknowledge you when you talk to him. So you sit next to the monk and pray for a minute, which warms him up to you. Afterwards, during the dialogue, he asks for your name, after the telling of which he then grants you a gift and a blessing. This interaction is beyond the capabilities of the original game. The key is that the world doesn't feel dead anymore, since interactions similar to this one are now common. This sequel seems to address and fix almost every problem of the original, and in doing so, it becomes a much more playable and interesting game.
It's linear.
What?
The original game had a great concept of non-linear adventure through an open world. The sequel makes the mistake of forcing the player to follow a linear path. Every new puzzle appears only after you've solved the previous one, when in the first game, the player could approach every puzzle in the game whenever he wanted to.
Yeah, this is an unfortunate thing. I mean, there are still multiple solutions to puzzles and an open environment with secrets and items to find, but the fact that the game has a predetermined order in which you have to solve puzzles does take away from the non-linearity of the game. The point is that this game has a sort of compounded freedom. It only gives you choices at specific times instead of just letting you do whatever you want. It sometimes allows you to be free instead of being built around the player's freedom, like how the original was. Also, even though the game fixed a lot of flaws, it didn't fix them all. The limited vocabulary is still an issue that takes some fun out of the gameplay. The world is still bland, and there are a couple of flaws that only appeared in this game. Laughable pathfinding of the AI, cheap dead ends, warped perspectives, there are a lot of flaws which just plague this game. However, I do believe that this is a much better game than the original. The immense improvements to the puzzle solving and the game as a whole make it tremendously more enjoyable, even though it is much more linear. But the flaws are too innumerable to call this a good game, so overall, King's Quest II is a mediocre game. This game is very different from the rest, even though at first it might seem like it's the same thing. King Graham is not the protagonist anymore. The story of this game follows a new character, Gwydion, and his attempt at escaping a wizard who stole the hero from his parents when he was just a baby. As a matter of fact, this is the wizard's routine. In order to have a complacent servant to do his chores, he steals a kid, and then, after the child has slaved for 18 years, he murders and replaces him. Instantly you can notice that the story is much darker this time around, and so is the world. There are no friendly characters like in the previous games. In fact, everything feels mean-spirited, like Gwydion is alone and no one will help him. What is especially cruel is that the wizard, whom you are absolutely going to hate by the way, appears to order you chores, and if you don't obey him, he will punish you. Other than ordering you around, he is either spying on the common folk or doing his evil research. In fact, he is so evil that he occasionally appears just to stare at you, just to remind you that you are constantly being watched and you can't hide. Wizard is absolutely the most interesting character in the entire trilogy, and he contributes greatly to the overarching mean-spirited atmosphere, which, along with the improved presentation, creates a much more intriguing, immersive world. So, undeniably, King's Quest III has the best world in the entire trilogy, but that's not saying much. However, what is truly notable about this title is that it made significant changes to the gameplay. The previous games had two great concepts: non-linear exploration of an open world and puzzle solving with multiple solutions. The third game surprisingly decided to replace them with two different yet equally interesting concepts of spellcasting and real-time gameplay. So the developers decided that instead of retreading the same ground for the third time, they should make something fresh and original, which is good. However, they managed to realize those new concepts even worse than the previous ones. Let's look at spellcasting, which actually is much more similar to alchemy. In the manual there are 7 formulas which all require certain ingredients in order to make them. Once you have all the ingredients, you can cast a spell by carefully retyping instructions from the manual into the game. That's it. There's nothing interesting about this. You just sit down and over a course of 30 minutes retype words like a goddamn schoolboy doing his homework. The utter pointlessness of this is stunning. Remember how in the original King's Quest you could find an item and then use it? Simple, right? In this game you find items and you need to go to a very hard to get location, type words for half an hour, and only then get an actually useful item. This entire spellcasting mechanic is nothing more than a tacked-on gimmick made to waste the player's time, which is sad since the concept itself has a lot of potential. Remember the game Lowe? This game was designed around the concept of magic, and it worked perfectly. You learn spells which you can cast in form of music, the spells which can be creatively applied to solve puzzles, and can even be reversed. That is something you couldn't achieve with a simple item-based system. And compared to that, you can definitely see how horrible the King's Quest III spellcasting really is. And now the real time. Remember how in the Last Express you could find different events depending on where you are at each specific time? Remember how it allowed you to experience the game in many different ways, increasing both replayability and engagement in the interactive, non-linear story.
Sorry to keep you waiting, I ran across an old friend.
Good. Now let's get back to our game. After 5 minutes, Wizard leaves and you have only 25 minutes left to not just understand what to do, but to make a spell to defeat the wizard. Believe me, it's not easy. By the end of those 25 minutes, he kills you. Unless you hide your possessions under your bed, which you wouldn't know to do unless someone told you. So what we have in form of the real time is just another inconvenience to the player, which in this case forces him to restart the game and backtrack to where he was, only to have 10 stressful minutes of trying to figure out what to do and then reloading by the end of them, only to backtrack again. It's just tedious. There was no reason to include this in a game other than to annoy the player. These concepts feel forced, tacked on. It seems like the developers didn't put any thought in how to implement those new ideas and instead decided to just throw them into the game with the hope of it somehow working out. And it didn't. What we have is a complete mess. The real problem is how, instead of deepening the gameplay, these concepts get in the way of puzzle solving. They just distract and waste the player's time. They force him to backtrack without any reason to, which only serves to annoy him, since all the player wants is to solve puzzles and advance in the game. And this leads me to the fundamental problem of King's Quest III. The developers changed the core of the game, without changing the game itself. How can a slow-paced game with a time-sinking gameplay have a time limit? Why, instead of simply picking up and using items, the game forces you to backtrack after you find those items and type for half an hour to get the ability to use them? I'll tell you why. Because it's a poorly designed game. So what we have is a broken, misguided mess of a game. It doesn't even... It's so horrible. It's so horrible. King's Quest III is a bad game. Whew. That last game, it makes the original King's Quest seem like a masterpiece in comparison.
Glad we can agree on that.
So after playing the entire trilogy, I would have to say that the most playable is King's Quest II. So if you want to play a retro adventure game, you should probably check this one out. Or better yet, just play any of the games that I've name dropped during the course of this review, since these games are much more worthy of your time. They're actually good.
I still don't get why did you decide to play the sequels. Only the first game mattered.
I don't know. I didn't have any other plans for today. What else could I have done?
You could have played another game.
Good point. Good point.